Six more top advisors to the former president got word late today that the House Select Committee on January 6 wants to talk with them. And as it has with so many others, the committee isn't asking them, it's telling them. The six, all receiving subpoenas, first to produce documents, then appear before the committee. Now, most are pretty familiar names if you follow this sort of thing. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who in December of last year reportedly took part in an Oval Office meeting during which participants discussed seizing voting machines and exercising emergency powers. Also, 2020 campaign manager Bill Stepien, former senior campaign advisor Jason Miller, senior campaign official Angela McCollum, former New York police commissioner and pardoned felon Bernie Kerik, who was part of the Willard Hotel war room set up to overturn the election. Then there's John Eastman, the president's attorney, who put together that memo which amounted to a step-by-step guide to the former vice president sparking a coup.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
It's Rudy Giuliani applauding him on. That was Eastman at the rally leading up to the insurrection, laying out the essence of a memo that would only come to light months later and might never have seen the light of day had the scheme actually succeeded. Now the Select Committee wants to know more. The question, though, is will they get it from him or any of the other five or any of the others they've subpoenaed? Tonight, it's hard to see how. On Friday, former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, whom the former president wanted to take over the Justice Department, appeared before the committee but refused to speak until the question of executive privilege makes it through the courts. Then there's Steve Bannon, who stiff-armed the committee entirely and whom Congress held in contempt, referring his case to the Justice Department. That was more than 2.5 weeks ago. Today, Attorney General Merrick Garland was asked to comment on it. He declined, saying only, quote, "We evaluate these in the normal way we do, looking at the facts and law and applying principles of prosecution." Keeping them honest, these are certainly not normal times, nor have many of the big-name subpoena recipients so far responded in any normal way other than with delay tactics, stonewalling, or in Bannon's case, outright contempt. Quite an example for the latest six to follow. Joining us now is CNN Chief Domestic Correspondent Jim Acosta, also Elizabeth Holtzman, who is Congresswoman from New York, served on the House Judiciary Committee during Watergate. So, Jim, these six people, they're obviously staunch loyalists of the former president. Is there any reason to think that any of them would consider cooperating?
No, I think these six, they're all going to dig in, Anderson. You know, there have been some low-level associates of the former president who have been apparently cooperating to some extent, maybe because they can't afford the legal fees. But, you know, these six, they're pretty integral to what the January 6th committee is investigating. You talk about John Eastman, who wrote that infamous memo trying to say that the former vice president could throw out the election results from the 2020 election. You have Jason Miller, who was crafting statements from the former president at that time. You have Bill Stepien, who was the campaign manager of the 2020 campaign for the former president. So these are very important, influential people in that process who are apparently involved in that infamous meeting that was going on over at the Willard Hotel here in Washington. But Anderson, I talked to a former Trump advisor earlier this evening who said, listen, you know, it looks like what the January 6th committee is doing, and it's logical that they're going to do this, is talk to every person around the former president, perhaps in the hopes of, trying to get cooperation from the former president himself at some point. And this advisor went on to say that many of them feel like it's a good thing that they were using encrypted messaging to speak with one another during this time in the run-up to the January 6th insurrection. And so that gives you a sense as to how they were thinking in advance that what they were doing might not go over well from a legal standpoint. The other thing, Anderson, that I think needs to be said is that all of this is really in the hands of the Attorney General Merrick Garland. If he is not going to enforce this subpoena that Steve Bannon is thumbing his nose at right now, the rest of these six, anybody else who receives a subpoena from Congress can do the exact same thing. Yeah. And honestly, that's something that should just have every red-blooded American out there pissed as hell that the executive branch can thumb its nose at the legislative branch and the judicial branch when it comes to something as important and as insane as a coup aimed at overturning the election results.
Ms. Holtzman, how crucial will the Department of Justice's decision to either prosecute or not prosecute Steve Bannon be, you think, in getting these Trump allies to cooperate with the Select Committee?
I think it's vital. I think the committee's gotten a lot of information. We hear from the lower level people, the underlings who apparently cooperated or talked to them. I mean, the committee says they've interviewed 150 people, but these are the key people, and their testimony is vital. I don't understand how the Justice Department can be taking this kind of laid back approach. There are two problems with that. One is the clock, which is running. It's possible that if the Republicans take over the House in the midterm elections, we can have a very different situation. So it behooves the Attorney General to move promptly on this. But the second thing is, as Jim said, if the Congress can't subpoena information and get information, and in this case, it's not information about just anything, it's information about an attempt to overthrow a presidential election by force. If Congress can't get that information, then what information can it get? I mean, during the impeachment of Nixon, we subpoenaed information. The president stonewalled us, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled. And that was vital in getting every single Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, and I think almost every Republican in Congress, was going to vote for his removal. Yeah. We have a massive cover-up going on now. And the president should be ashamed about it, but we have to call it for what it is. And the Justice Department has to be part of the solution to this problem, which is to bring the documents, bring the testimony to light. What the truth is, you can only find out by doing that.
Jim, obviously the White House doesn't want to be seen as pressuring, and you know, President Biden already received criticism and actually apologized for, or at least said it was the wrong thing to do when he said that he thought, you know, the Justice Department should move forward.
That's right, and I think that is why, you know, this is really all on the Attorney General at this point, and that's why you have so many Democrats who are just hopping mad with Merrick Garland. I talked to a House Democrat earlier this evening who said they want to see Trump and his associates held accountable, and if they're not going to cooperate with the January 6th committee, that they should be prosecuted. That is a very baseline feeling among a lot of Democrats. But listen, you know, we're talking about people like Michael Flynn, who already was in trouble once before for lying to federal investigators, received a pardon from the former president. I mean, these are the kinds of people that we're dealing with. Of course, they're not going to cooperate. And so, you know, as Elizabeth was saying, we're faced with a choice. Do congressional subpoenas from this point forward carry the same legal weight as a Hallmark card? Pretty please, Mother May I, will you cooperate with the January 6th committee? We just can't have that kind of system of government in this country, or else you're going to give the executive branch all the power in the world to do whatever they want from here until kingdom come. And Anderson, the Republicans need to think about this. They very well could be in charge come next November, in a year from now. Do they want to have their subpoenas essentially be declared null and void and have no legal weight whatsoever? Because that is the precedent that they're setting right now.
Congresswoman, if you were on the Select Committee, what would you want to be hearing from the people who have been subpoenaed?
Well, first of all, I want to see the documents, the emails before I question them. But basically, I'd like to see, for example, from Michael Flynn, what he proposed about martial law and what President Trump said to him in response to the proposal. Was the president willing to go along with using martial law, with using the military to overturn an election? Were we there? We'd like to know more about what John Eastman said to the president and what the president said to him. And so those are really critical things. What the president knew and when he knew it, the same questions that that came up in Watergate, those are exactly the same questions we need to have answered now.
Congresswoman Holtzman, Jim Costa, appreciate it. Thank you.